So today we're in Mark chapters 13 and the first part of chapter 14, verses 1 through 42. Got that on my reading plan here. Hopefully you're following along. Wanted to just take a moment to get our bearings on where we're at during this, what's called the Passion Week, from Jesus' entry into Jerusalem to his resurrection. So this week began, if you recall, in chapter 11, verses 1 through 11. And that's a Sunday, so that's the first day of the week. And the only thing narrated there is in Mark, is the Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. So he's received as the king by the people. Of course, you know the leaders are not on the same page, leading the people astray. Chapters 11 verses 12 through 19 then happen on Monday and the next day. And the events there are the cursing of the fig tree. So Jesus goes out in the morning, curses that fig tree. We've talked about that. And then Jesus' cleansing of the temple. My view, it's the second time he's done this. But that happens on Monday. Tuesday then begins in chapter 11, verse 20, and it's a really long, I don't know if it's a longer day than any other, but it's got a lot of events packed into it, all the way to chapter 13, verse 37. So I've got a list here. On Tuesday, we find that the fig tree he cursed is now withered, and we talked about that being leading to a lesson about prayer. We find him challenged by the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of Israel, so the people who should be leading Israel are challenging Israel's Messiah. We see a section then on Tuesday of Jesus' rejection of Israel. And then this is followed by a lot of challenges. If you recall, we talked about how they were trying to publicly challenge and possibly humiliate Jesus so that he would lose credibility in the eyes of the people. They being the leaders of Israel. So first he's questioned by the Pharisees and the Herodians about taxes. Then he's questioned about the Sadducees about the resurrection, and the scribes about the greatest commandment. So they're all taking their turns trying to trip him up. And then Jesus turns the tables on them and he questions them about something that they should know. Key text in the Old Testament, Psalm 110. It's the most quoted psalm in the New Testament. It's so important. He asks the scribes specifically a question about Psalm 110. You know, if David calls the Messiah Lord, then how can he be David's son? They, of course, don't answer him. The only answer is that he is David's God. But they don't answer him. Jesus then takes that occasion to warn the disciples about pride. I think the implication being that they were trying to protect their pride by not answering. Then Jesus talks, and that's where we pick it up today, about the tribulation and second coming. This is parallel to what we saw in Matthew 24. Just go on here in our reading today, chapter 14, verses 1 to 11, then happens on Wednesday. So it's finally the next day. It was a lot of events on Tuesday, but Wednesday opens with a plot to kill Jesus, so the leaders are fed up with it, and they're going to look for an opportunity to kill Jesus. And then Jesus is anointed at Simon the leper's house. We've seen this also in Matthew. And then where he is, Judas at that point determines he's going to betray Jesus. So that's how Wednesday closes out. Thursday opens on chapter 14, verse 12, and goes through 42, our reading for today as well. We see a preparation for the Passover, then the Passover itself. And Jesus takes his disciples first to the Mount of Olives where they pray, then to the Garden of Gethsemane, and then finally in the garden he is betrayed. So that's the layout chronologically of this week that we're in, this Passion Week of Jesus. So let's take a look at chapter 13, Again, this is Wednesday. I'm sorry, it's the end of the day Tuesday. I have to look at my notes there myself. End of the day Tuesday, and Wednesday doesn't start until chapter 14. So we'll see Jesus talking about the coming tribulation and his return. We've seen that in Matthew 24 and 25. We see it again here in Mark 13, and we'll see it again in Luke. So all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, relate what Jesus said about this. There's so much parallel between them. These Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels. Syn is same or similar, and optic is vision. So they're taking the same view, basically, of Jesus. They've arranged the material a little bit differently. Some put in details that others leave out, but by and large, they're looking at the same events and reporting them. We're going to see next year, when we look more closely at the life of Jesus, we'll compare the accounts and see how they're similar and how they're different, and try to put together a kind of a view, stereo view of what they're all observing. But Jesus is here first talking about the beginning of the tribulation. So this is a period of time. It's called in the Old Testament the time of Jacob's trouble. It's about tribulation, trouble falling on Israel, particularly, but it'll be a worldwide tribulation. You know, the church has problems today. The church is persecuted all over the world right now. But those are local. What Jesus is anticipating here and what the book of Revelation talks about is a global tribulation that's coming on the whole earth, that Israel is going to particularly suffer, but the whole earth is going to experience it. It's going to open with a time of betrayal, and that's what Jesus talks about here in chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. People are going to come. They're going to try to lead his people astray. It's very important that we be vigilant, that they be vigilant during this time. Glad I caught myself there. It reminds me. Lots of people try to take these verses and apply them to the church today. But remember, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's talking to them about Israel. So this is an event that the church is not going to experience. We're going to know about it, but the church is not going to experience this event or the things that Jesus describes here. Starting in verse 9, then, we have a picture of what Revelation will show us later is the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. So the tribulation itself is a period of 7 years. The first 3.5 years are called the tribulation. The second 3.5 years are called the Great Tribulation, and I'll show you why that is in a minute. He tells them in verse 9 to be on their guard. Why? Because they're going to be delivered over to the synagogues. They're going to be beaten. They're going to be betrayed by the people closest to them. Look at verse 12, for example. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child. And children will rise against their parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. Interesting conclusion here, but he who endures to the end will be saved. Again, people try to take this and apply it to the church, and they say that, in order for us to have real salvation, then we have to persevere as church members. If we don't, then we've lost our salvation. That's what Jesus is saying here. He's not saying anything like that, brothers and sisters. You can be sure of your salvation, not because you're so good, but because God is so faithful. What he's saying here is that those who endure to the end of this period of tribulation will be saved out of it. That's what he's talking about here. He's talking to the Jews. Verse 14 then is this period in the middle of the tribulation. We know that because he talks about the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be. He's referring to something in the book of Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. that talks about this abomination being set up after the first 3.5 years. They're going to desecrate the temple, which will be standing at that time. And then he describes that he describes this period of time as such a tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created, now and never will be. So this is going to be unprecedented, is what Jesus is saying here. And then beginning in verse 24, notice those words, but in those days after the tribulation. So he's talking about his return and his second coming in verses 24 down to 27. And then he gives a practical lesson, again, from the fig tree, with the thrust of that lesson is be ready. Don't be caught off guard. These are, the Jews will need to be in the Bible. If they weren't before the tribulation, they'll need to be in it. Perhaps in the future this YouTube video will survive and someone will see it and they'll say, oh, this is what's happening. Well, he's telling them to be ready, to be on their guard. And that's how he closes that chapter, is warning the nation to be ready. Wednesday begins in 14:1, 2 days before the Passover. And again, here the chief priest and the scribes are seeking a way to kill him. Jesus is just outside of Jerusalem at this point in Bethany. It's about 2 miles from Jerusalem, just south on the Mount of Olives. And he's anointed here. This is his anointing. Very expensive perfume. Oil was used to anoint him, which causes several people to take exception, Judas among them. And Judas joins the plot to kill Jesus. Thursday then begins in chapter 12, in verse 12 of chapter 14. And what we see here is the preparation for the Passover in verses 12 through 16, and then the Passover itself in verses 17 through 25. They go outside then after the Passover is finished. They go outside Jerusalem. Jesus leads them out, and as he leads them out, he quotes Zechariah again. You know, this is significant. We've seen Zechariah quoted several times now. This is the third time. Here he quotes Zechariah 13:7. Earlier he had quoted Zechariah 9:9 and also 13:27, just in these few verses, or in these few chapters. So Zechariah is very prominent in Jesus' last week of his life here. So Jesus leads them out. First they go out to the Mount of Olives, and then in verse 26, and then he leads them out in verse 32 to Gethsemane. And then while they are in Gethsemane, Jesus, of course, prays. And we're going to stop there. Verse 42, he's about to be betrayed. So that's your reading for the day, brothers and sisters. I hope the overview of the week, the Passion Week, has helped you, kind of orient you where you are at. And, I'd encourage you, Lord, to spend time just reflecting on Jesus's, what's happening to him here, and how he is both meek as a lamb, really being led into this, knowing full well what the Old Testament predicted. And at the same time, we see Jesus really in charge here, teaching his disciples, preparing them. I don't know if it was my last week on earth, I'd be caring so much about other people as Jesus cares about them and cares about us. So reflect on that, brothers and sisters, and press on in your reading. Tomorrow we'll pick it up in verse 43 and go to 16:20, which will close out the Gospel of Mark. You can click off another book, and good for you. God bless you.